might have picked up from coaches or magazines or and I'm not a nutrition expert. We have to be careful when we're in this field because you will know quite a lot about nutrition, but you're not a qualified nutritionist. So when you are giving information to athletes or students or clients, be careful how you phrase that, right? Say, well, you may want to try, rather than you should try, right? You may want to look into this as an idea, or the CDC and the American Heart Association and the ACSM recommend this amount of protein, right? So that you're not taking responsibility personally for the information that you are passing on, okay? It's very tempting to jump in and create diets and all kinds of things for people, but really try to put the onus on them. There are some great websites. If you put them to myplate.gov and you give them the introductory information to look for, then if they're motivated, they can find what they need. All right? So just as I say, just a little side warning, be careful, because unless you go on and take a nutrition qualification, we're really not in a position to be creating diets for people. Okay? Just to point out, we're going to talk about glycemic index as a carbohydrate issue, but we're not going to look at that as an exam issue, all right? Because we're going to gloss over it very, very quickly, and it's actually a little bit more complicated than we're going to be looking at. And so I just want you to concentrate on carbs rather than get hung up on GI info, okay? So we have technically 6 food groups, all right? We've got carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and they count water as a food group. We're going to be doing most of our hydration information in the next chapter, all right? But I want you to try, while we're going through certainly carbs and fats and proteins, I want you to be thinking back to our ATP production, what we've learned about when do we use carbs, when do we use fats, so that you link this back to the previous information to expand your knowledge base, all right? So carbohydrates contain 4 kilocalories per gram, so that's our energy measure, all right? So 4 calories per gram. And it really does depend which reference you're looking at. The current issue of the textbook refers to the American Dietetic Association. Their recommendation is that if you look at your overall calorie intake across a period of time, that between 45 to 65% of your calories should be coming from carbohydrates. Many references that you look at say 45 to 50. That's more typical for a normal person, all right? Going up to 65 allows us to incorporate our athletes and people who are exercising at a high level, okay? So we'll come back to that idea. We might not want to go all the way up to 65% of our intake with an office worker, for example, right? So, our glycemic index foods are divided into high, moderate, and low glycemic index. High amounts of the high glycemic index group can interfere with protein and fat intakes, all right? And they can promote laying down additional triglyceride stores in our fat cells, all right? Because the insulin that you release in response to eating carbohydrate inhibits the enzymes that are responsible for breaking down fat, okay? So, again, you've got to be a little bit careful because it's a really high GI group, all right? Doesn't mean we don't need carbohydrates, and low carbohydrate diets are problematical, particularly for athletes. Okay, so it's not just our muscles that are going to use that carbohydrate. White blood cells use glucose as an energy source. Many other cells use glucose as an energy source. Your brain, unless you have been on a very low carbohydrate diet for a long time, after which your brain will switch to being able to use ketones from proteins and fats. But mostly, your brain works almost 100% off of glucose, all right, from the bloodstream. So you need at least 130 grams per day for your brain to function at the level that you'd like it to. Which is one of the reasons why when you're hungry or when your blood sugar is low, you make daft decisions, right? Because your brain is not receiving the glucose that it needs under those circumstances. So you do silly things and you twist your ankle, or you have a row with someone you really shouldn't have had a row from, you should have walked away, right? But you weren't making a sensible choice at the time, okay? Or we go shopping in Walmart when we're hungry. Bad plan. Bad plan. We make very poor choices for our shopping cart when we're hungry, right? The RDA for carbs is 300 grams per day. I'm not as keen on this idea personally. I find this, when I want to look at a percentage of my overall intake being carbs, rather than an amount. And part of that is because some days I'm very lazy and other days I'm very active. And so I find myself adjusting my carb intake quite dramatically day to day. And if I'm looking at a set number, somehow that feels more difficult to be flexible, to me personally anyway. Oh, and I'm going to switch over to the other PowerPoint for this slide because none of the lines work. Hey, well, it's not working there either. Well, that's not helpful, is it? Okay, let's get rid of that. So there are other benefits to having a good amount of carbohydrate in your diet. Having low fats and high fiber within your diet has been shown to promote health benefits, particularly when we look at things like cardiovascular disease. So when we're looking at our exercise situation or our physical activity, then carbs are our preferred source, even for our aerobic exercise, right? Remember, once we're working aerobically, we can use fat, but carbs are quicker to break down and turn into ATP. So unless I'm going to go for a long time, my carbs are still very useful, all right? The higher the intensity, remember our crossover rate, so if I'm going to do aerobic work at a high intensity, I'm going to work using more carbohydrate than I am fat. So we still need our carbs in our diet, right? It allows us to maintain a race pace that we set, right? And we use oxygen more efficiently if we're using carbohydrate rather than fat. So there's lots of reasons why carbs are beneficial for an aerobic athlete as well as an anaerobic athlete. Okay? So don't get carried away with the idea that we know we can use fats when we're working aerobically, that's all we want to use. We still need the carbs. Right? If we are doing long-term exercise, so if I'm going to be exercising for 2, 3, 4 hours, then over time we'll start to take stored glycogen from the liver to top up blood glucose, and eventually we'll deplete our liver glycogen store. And at that point, that's when you hear athletes say, oh, I hit the wall. My legs started wobbling and I couldn't run anymore. Or I had to stop cycling and get off the bike because my legs were wobbling so much. Okay? So we know that glycogen depletion is linked with fatigue, not just in anaerobic events, but in aerobic events. And in fact, more in aerobic, because an anaerobic event, even ones of quite long duration, don't generally last long enough to deplete liver glycogen. So if I'm working out for about an hour, then we see around 50 to 55% depletion. But if I'm working out at 2 hours or more, pretty hard, then we can see complete depletion of the liver. That means then I've got to eat quite a lot of carbohydrate to put it all back again, to replenish the pantry. Right? So if I'm doing repeated sprints, so if you're doing some kind of interval training, where you're sprinting and then jogging and then sprinting, over time, you could also use a lot of carbohydrate in that situation. All right? If you're doing resistance work, especially if you're doing high reps and many sets, you're going to be using carbohydrate for that resistance type training. All right? So, if we look at the idea that carb depletion and performance are linked, do we have data that really shows us that effect? All right, so this study was done looking at exercise sessions over time, and then on the y-axis they were measuring muscle glycogen. They weren't even looking at liver glycogen in this study. But still we can see what happens. All right, so the blue line is taking in a high carbohydrate diet. And bear in mind, it's a research study, so they always push everything to extremes. So in this instance, this high carb diet is 70%, so it's way over the recommended amount of carb for a diet. All right, it's a really, really high carb diet. Okay? And again, on the other end, they push it to extremes. The red line is a low carb diet, 40%. So that's under the minimum amount that is recommended. Okay? So our first training bout depletes muscle glycogen. All right? And then we have a 24-hour time period where we eat the high carb or the low carb. And then we train again, and we see depletion in both cases. And then we have another 24-hour period, and we see depletion. But you see how low this is here? This was a pretty crappy exercise session. This was not fun, all right? And unless I eat carbohydrate, we have a minimal store. If you go all the way back to chapter 2, I think it is, we were looking at about 2,500 calories stored as carbohydrate and something like 70-odd thousand calories stored as fat. Right? So if I use them all up, I have to put them back. Right? We don't make carb, we have to eat it. Okay? So this low carb diet, you would never be that low, hopefully. Even if you were on a low carb diet, hopefully it wouldn't be this low. Although some of the new protein diets are pretty poor on the carb intake. All right? So we've got a serious drop in performance when we're looking at muscle glycogen levels that are this low. Okay? So if I'm an endurance athlete, I don't want to hit the wall, right? That's a big problem because I have to either stop or I have to slow down dramatically to manage that situation, all right? And then I'm either losing time against my goal end time, or I'm losing the race if that was the purpose of running, right? So we want to find a way to stock up the pantry as high as possible before the start of the race, right? So I've got as much glycogen as I can stored in the muscles, and I've got as much glycogen as I can shove into the liver as possible, okay? So for most athletes, when they're training, particularly during a high volume period of training program, they need more than 50% carbohydrate intake, all right? And then it depends on what kind of training you're going to be doing, all right? So the recommendation is that if you are a strength athlete, so you're a shot put, or you are the linebacker on the football team, or you're a bodybuilder or a power lifter, right? Then the recommendation is between 55 and 60% of your nutrition should be carbohydrate, okay? If you're an endurance athlete, then there are times in your program when you should be consuming up to the 65% maximum. For all athletes, right, it doesn't matter what you're doing, not taking in enough carbohydrate can lead to an inability to maintain your work output during your training session, right? Or maybe the amount of sets or the amount of days in the week that you're going to be training. Over a long period of time, it will lead to a loss in muscle mass, which obviously as an athlete we do not want, right? We want to stay as strong as we can. And you'll see poor adaptation to all the work. So you're putting in all this work, but you're not seeing the adaptation that you expect for the level of work that you're doing. Okay? When we're talking about taking in carbohydrate, it's important that we look at what does that carbohydrate involve. Because my lollipop sucker thing is carbohydrate, right? but it's a simple carbohydrate, like a soda, like a Coca-Cola or a I don't know, I don't drink soda, so whatever those are, right? So, one of the things I think that when you're an athlete you don't always realize, because you use so much energy, you can drink soda, you can eat candy, and it doesn't seem to have any effect on your body composition, because when it's a simple sugar, it's immediately released as glucose into the bloodstream, and you have this dramatic insulin response, but you're going straight into the gym and lifting, and so all that glucose transfers into your muscles and you use it up as energy, right? Now that's great, but you develop these eating habits, which then when you stop competing, then you've got to not only lose your sport and your competition, you've suddenly got a dramatic diet change that you have to tackle, because now you can't eat candy and soda and it not affect your body composition, because you're not about to go and spend 2 hours lifting in the gym because, uh-oh, I have to go to work and earn the money to pay the mortgage now, right? Much rather go to the gym, but hey ho, this is life, okay? So even as an athlete, and I kick LV every time I see him walking around with a damn sucker in his mouth. That is not good modeling for you guys, right? Even as an athlete, even though you can get away with this, it's not a good habit to get into, because habits are hard to break, right? It's much better that your carbohydrates are complex in nature, right? Complex in nature means that they break down more slowly. We get a much more steady release of glucose into the bloodstream, which means we don't get a sharp insulin spike. We get a much more kind of steady release of insulin. Another interesting thing is that when you are at rest, right, these carbs are much more likely to be stored as fat, and these carbs are much more likely to be stored as glycogen. Okay? And what we want is higher glycogen stores. Okay? Complex carbs, we're looking at grains, starches, vegetables, fruits, all right? All come under complex carbs. Some fruits and vegetables are more on the continuum towards the simple end, so like grapes. We all love grapes because they're so sweet, but they got a lot of pure sugar and they pump into the bloodstream much, much faster than an apple would, right? So you might have to decide, am I going to have my grapes before training, or am I going to have my grapes with my dinner before I go to bed? What is it I'm looking to achieve with my food? Right? So there's a very strong correlation between your carbohydrate intake, your muscle glycogen store, and endurance performance. And this is too small here, but it's in the book. All right. What they're showing you here is, down here is muscle glycogen, and here is time to exhaustion. All right. The blue dot is down here. That's a low carb diet. Okay. So I've got low muscle glycogen storage, and I have a very short time relative to the other diets to exhaustion. All right. Green dot this end is high carbs, very high muscle glycogen content, much longer time to exhaustion. All right. Okay, so there is a table in your book about the glycemic index. As I said, I'm going to run through it pretty quick because it's not something I want to specifically put in the exam, but these days A lot of resources use the glycemic index as the measure for carbohydrate, whether you're reading research or you're reading an article, or even on the food label, depending which country you're in. Like when I was back at home at Christmas, I noticed they have a glycemic index on the food label in the supermarket now. So I just want to make sure that you have an idea of how it works. One of the tricky things I find when I'm looking about GI, this glycemic index, is that it's not necessarily a poor nutrition item, all right? So for example, my potato, which is a really good source of carbohydrate, counts as a high glycemic food, okay? Here's the thing though, if you add fats and proteins, it lowers the glycemic index because it takes longer to be absorbed by the small intestine. So if I have my jacket potato and I put a tin of baked beans on it, or a tin of tuna, and I grate some cheese, now my potato is not such a problem. It's a really good source of carbohydrate, and it's not going to be absorbed so fast that I'm starving hungry in half an hour. Right? So what they're looking at, the way they decide the number is by comparing the food to how your blood glucose reacts to 100 grams, I think, of pure glucose. Right? So when you buy a GI diet book or a GI table, it's an average response in relation to pure glucose. Okay? So high means that after I've eaten it, if this is my blood sugar, I eat it and my blood sugar is going to do this. Right? Well, this means I have a very high insulin response. Right? Insulin's job is to transport glucose across the membrane, out of the bloodstream, into the muscle tissue. So when we get to diabetics, we're going to come back to this idea, because the reason they came up with a glycemic index diet was to help diabetics who have to control this insulin response and these blood sugar spikes. All right? So the lower the number, the lower the spike, the less insulin response, the less likely you are then to have a hypoglycemic attack straight after you've eaten something. Okay. If you are using the glycemic index with regards to your exercising, so if you've got a diabetic who is a client, okay, then the recommendation, although the research is a little bit equivocal, it doesn't all agree with itself, unfortunately. It's typical in exercise physiology. High glycemic foods are good to eat during the exercise. So, or if you're a marathon runner, or like when I was doing the snowshoe race, I made sure to have some raisins in my pocket, because about every 10 to 15 minutes, if I don't have a handful of raisins, my knees start doing this while I'm on the snowshoe, right? Before the exercise, you should be avoiding these high glycemic and eating more moderate levels, because you want to top up your blood sugar for the beginning of the exercise, but you don't want a huge spike. Right? And then in recovery, for the first 24 hours, you want to mix these high and moderates. As I say, the research is really not constant on that. I still think the best way to play food is to keep a food diary. Keep a heart rate diary, keep a food diary every day, and see how you feel in response to what you ate the day before. Right? If you have a cruddy training session and your legs feel like concrete and each leg weighs 100 pounds, and then you go, oh, you know what, I had that chicken salad for dinner last night. That's all I had. Lettuce and chicken. I wonder why my legs feel so heavy. Right? Because your muscle glycogen is low. Okay? I trained really, really hard. I depleted muscle glycogen, and I ate chicken and lettuce for dinner. And then I wonder why my legs don't want to do anything for me on day 2. Right? Another one. So another strategy that endurance athletes can use is what we call carbohydrate loading. All right? And the idea behind carbohydrate loading is that I kind of bump up how much carbs I eat before I go and compete. Okay? And the original kind of plan for this was created by Swedish, I think he was Swedish, coach called Astrand, exercise physiologist called Astrand. And his original plan was that you did, so a week out from your marathon, right?
Yeah.
You do a really, really hard training day, and you deplete your glycogen as much as you can. And then for the next 3 days, you have a low-carb diet, but you keep training. And then for the last 3 days before your marathon, you have a very high-carb diet, and you don't do very much exercise at all. Okay. I'll show you a graph in a minute. It works very well, right? It results in very high levels of stored carbohydrate. But there are some pretty big disadvantages to the old-fashioned method, okay? One is you've got 7 days where something different is happening every few days, going into a major race, which can be unsettling, right? You have some, if I'm having a low-carb diet, that means there has to be more fat and more protein. And for some athletes, that gives them gastrointestinal distress, right? Their tolerance is not very high to that kind of diet because that's not what they typically eat, all right? Plus, you have these 3 days of really low muscle glycogen, and you're still trying to train quite hard. Those are very unpleasant. Right? This is not a nice training set. And then you have 3 days right before your major world championships where you're not doing anything. Right? So as we learn more and more about exercise physiology, how the body responds, psychology of athletes, we now have modified plans that skip out the low-carb portion and have more consistent, please, more consistent training routines during the week. All right? So let's go back to the other one so we can see the graph now. So this red line here is the Astrand, is the 1960s version. All right? So here's my hard training day, I deplete all my muscle glycogen, I keep trying to train, not very nice, and then I have 3 days basically resting and stuffing my face, and I end up with lots of carbohydrate, which is great, right? But again, this isn't really a very sensible training plan. So now we have plans where they keep their mixed diet, right? We train at our normal periodization plan coming into a race, and then we have the last few days with high carbs, but we continue training. We don't give up our training on these newer plans, right? So I don't go into a race having not really done anything for a couple of days. Okay? Right? So it's a really good plan if I'm a long distance endurance athlete. It works for any sport where you've got repetitive muscle recruitment for a long time without very much rest. So, soccer is a good one. Racquetball is quite a good one. Some forms of resistance training plans would benefit from this. Okay? Would American football players benefit from carb loading? No, because the amount of work they do is high intensity, very, very short duration, and then they go and sit down for a couple of hours while the other half of the team does the work. Right? Whatever it is they do when they're not out there running around. Okay? So it's a really beneficial tool for the right athlete. It's not going to help your 100-meter sprinter. Right? Not even your 400-meter sprinter. It's got to be long distance, long duration. Okay? So one of the questions that often comes up is, well, what do I eat before the race or before I train? All right. So do I eat carbs? What should I be having before? And how long should I leave from eating to training? All right. So again, it's highly individual. All right. Some people can take carbohydrate up to 45 minutes, up to 15 minutes, and be fine. Right? Some people can't. If I'm hypoglycemic, if I have a tendency to have low blood sugar, or certain diabetic individuals, then eating carbs gives me a very quick drop, about 15 minutes to half an hour into my training session, and now I'm feeling hungry and I can't concentrate on what I'm supposed to be doing, and then I don't put in very much effort because I'm hungry, right? And it can have a detrimental effect on the training program. So for some people it's much better not to have sugar, so to avoid having a banana. Right? That might not be the right thing to have before training. You might be better off having some rice crackers or a piece of cheese or something so you don't feel hungry, but nothing that is going to fill you up too much and sit in your stomach because it can't be digested. Right? Some people can't eat 2 hours before they train or compete. Okay? And this is where sports drinks can come in useful. I'm not a big fan of sports drinks, they're expensive. You know, when you're an athlete, coach might be paying for your sports drinks, which is great. But when you're not an athlete and you're paying for them yourself, they're expensive. And for most people, they're not necessary. You can achieve what you achieve with a drink, with food, or with chocolate milk. Right? So we'll try to talk about that a little bit as well. But this might be a situation where a sport drink comes in useful because they can't eat something solid, but they can manage something fluid. Depends on the person. All right? Okay. Sports drinks. Segue into sports drinks. I always get myself in a right pickle with these, so I'm going to try and get it correct today. See if I can get it right. All right. So the point of using sports drinks is to try to provide a source of glucose to the working muscles so that you don't have to use all your stored muscle glycogen and you don't have to resort to your liver glycogen until absolutely necessary. Right? The longer I can put off using those stored forms of glycogen, the longer I've got before I hit the wall, and maybe I cross the finishing line before I hit the wall. Right? So that's the goal of carb and electrolyte drinks. The electrolytes are there because if I'm sweating a lot and I'm losing sodium and potassium and magnesium in my sweat, then remember that we need sodium and potassium to have proper nervous impulse travel. So for my heart to contract functionally and my muscles to contract the way I want them to, I need to maintain my electrolyte balance. Okay? And if I'm sweating, I'm losing water, I also want to maintain hydration, which we'll get to more in the next chapter. How effective these drinks are is dependent upon what we call gastric emptying. All right? Gastric emptying is how quickly, what's the rate that the drink is passing from the stomach into the small intestine. Because it's in the small intestine that we absorb electrolytes and water and carbohydrate, not in the stomach. Right? The stomach's just responsible for breaking stuff down and passing it on. Okay? And the formulation plays a big role because which type of carbohydrate it has mixed in, right? And which electrolytes, right? We think we need potassium, although the research doesn't support that. Although, I mean, theoretically it makes sense that we would need potassium, but the research at the moment doesn't support that the potassium in the electrolyte drink really does any good. Okay? What we want is a formula that is going to allow for the fastest absorption rate of the water and the carbohydrate. Okay? So this term osmolality comes up a lot in this chapter and the next chapter. Osmolality is the ratio of solutes in the drink to the fluid in the drink. Okay. And drinks will be termed isotonic, which means the solute in the drink matches the levels of solute in your body. They can be hypotonic or hypertonic. And I'm going to draw you this diagram because it's taken me flipping years to get to a point where I have any regular comprehension of this idea. All right, this is my small intestine. And and this is the cells outside, all right? So, if the drink is hypotonic, okay, that means it's low on solute and high on water, all right? So we'll have the solute as X's and the waters as O's. And it's hypotonic in relation to what's going on the other side of the membrane. So it's like our pressure gradient idea all over again, okay? So on the other side, if that's hypo, this side is going to be the hyper. It's going to have higher solute. So we've got lots and not much water over here. Right? So there's a saying that water follows solute. And that saying messed me up for many years. Because I had that pressure gradient idea fixed in my head, and it's back to front here, all right? I'm not looking at the solute moving across the membrane. I'm looking at the water moving across the membrane. So here, I'm low in solute, which means I'm high in water. And here I'm high in solute, and I'm low in water. And so my water moves from high to low. Right? The saying water follows solute is saying the same thing, because here I have more solute, and the water is following to the solute. So that we get a balance on either side of the membrane, technically, right? But as I said, that saying messed me up for a long time because I had the high-low thing fixed in my head so hard. So I think it's easier to go, okay, if it's low in solute, it's high in water, the water moves into the body. So if it's a hypotonic drink, I'm going to absorb water and it is going to benefit my hydration. Okay? If, on the other hand, there's too much carbohydrate in the drink, and the drink becomes hypertonic, now I've got tons of carbohydrate, so if I have lots of carbohydrate, that means I'm low on water. In my body, I'm relatively high on water compared to the drink, and it can drag water out of your body into your small intestine. So this isn't good because now it's dehydrating me, basically. It's removing water from my body. Okay? So we'll come back, we'll finish that little bit on Friday. We'll just review that idea again. And then we'll finish off sports drinks, and we will start, finish off sports drinks. We'll talk about carb consumption after exercise, and then we will start proteins.